The day the US Navy got played, and why no one's talking about it. Let me take you back to the evening of July 12, 2024. The Caribbean Sea, just north of Venezuela's territorial waters. A routine U.S. Navy patrol, part of the endless, grinding cycle of freedom of navigation operations, was tracking a suspicious vessel when something unprecedented happened. A Venezuelan diesel-electric submarine, the Caribbean, surfaced less than 2,000 yards from the USS Delbert D. Black, a guided missile destroyer. Not only did it surface, but it did so broadside, exposing its full profile to the American ship in what naval officers call a show of force. Then, in a move that sent ripples through the Pentagon, it submerged again, not fleeing, but circling the destroyer in a slow, deliberate loop before vanishing into the depths. The official statement from U.S. Southern Command was measured, almost a routine interaction with a Venezuelan naval asset. No escalation occurred. The media, predictably, moved on within 48 hours. A blip. A nothing burger. But here's the thing, I've spent the last 3 decades studying naval warfare, asymmetric threats, and the slow-burn collapse of American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. And what happened that night wasn't routine. It was a message. One that Washington doesn't want you to understand. Because if you peel back the layers, this wasn't just a Venezuelan submarine playing chicken with a U.S. warship. It was a calculated provocation, a test of resolve, and most importantly, a demonstration of how quickly the rules of the game are changing in America's own backyard. And the scariest part? The U.S. doesn't have a good answer. The official what they want you to believe. Let's start with the story we're supposed to accept. On July 12, the USS Delbert D. Black was conducting a routine maritime security operation in international waters near Venezuela's exclusive economic zone. According to the Pentagon, a Venezuelan Cibalo-class submarine, the Caribbean, was detected via sonar and subsequently surfaced near the destroyer. The U.S. Navy claims the interaction was professional and without incident, with both vessels going their separate ways after a brief visual confirmation. The media coverage, such as it was, framed this as a minor curiosity. Reuters ran a short piece quoting an anonymous defense official who called it unusual but not unprecedented. CNN mentioned it in passing as part of a broader story on rising tensions in Latin America. The New York Times didn't even bother. The subtext was move along, nothing to see here. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big one. First, the Cibalo-class submarines are not some rusting relics from the Cold War. They're German-built Type 209 diesel-electrics, among the quietest and most capable non-nuclear submarines in the world. They're designed for coastal defense, yes, but they're also extremely difficult to detect when running on batteries. The fact that the Caribbean surfaced so close to a U.S. destroyer isn't just bold, it's strategically reckless unless the Venezuelans were absolutely certain they could do it without consequence. Second, the U.S. Navy's response, or lack thereof, was telling. No warnings. No attempts to force the submarine to identify itself. No escort out of the area. Just silence. That's not how the U.S. operates when it feels its dominance is being challenged. When a Russian submarine loiters near a U.S. carrier, the Navy screams about it for weeks. When a Chinese sub surfaces near JA, it's front-page news. But when a Venezuelan sub does it in the Caribbean? Crickets. Third, and most damning, is the timing. This happened just days after the U.S. announced new sanctions on Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, and weeks after a high-profile meeting between Nicolas Maduro and a delegation from China's People's Liberation Army Navy. Coincidence? Maybe. But in geopolitics, coincidences are usually just facts that haven't been connected yet. So what's really going on here? Deconstructing the what the Pentagon isn't telling you. Let's start with the submarine itself. The Caribbean isn't just any sub, it's one of 2 Cibalo-class boats Venezuela acquired from Germany in the late 1970s. For decades, they were considered obsolete. But in 2018, Venezuela signed a secretive deal with Russia to modernize them. The upgrades included new sonar systems, improved battery capacity, and most critically, caliber-compatible torpedo tubes. That's the same family of cruise missiles Russia has used to devastating effect in Syria and Ukraine. Now, does this mean Venezuela can suddenly sink a U.S. carrier? No. But it does mean that a single submarine, operating in its home waters, could severely disrupt U.S. naval operations in the Caribbean. And that's a problem, because the U.S. Navy hasn't faced a peer or near-peer submarine threat in its own hemisphere since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Here's where it gets interesting. The Caribbean's surfacing wasn't just a show of force, it was a demonstration of capability. By surfacing so close to a U.S. destroyer, the Venezuelans were "we can see you. We can get this close. And if we wanted to, we could put a torpedo in your hull before you even knew we were there." That's not just posturing. That's a strategic warning. But why now? Why risk provoking the U.S. when Venezuela is already under crushing sanctions? The answer lies in resource nationalism. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, bigger than Saudi Arabia's. And right now, the U.S. is desperate to keep that oil off the market. Why? Because the Biden administration's green energy transition is faltering, global oil prices are volatile, and the last thing Washington wants is for Venezuela to start selling crude to China, India, or God forbid Russia. But here's the Venezuela has been selling oil. Not to the US, of course, but to China, via a shadow fleet of tankers that turn off their transponders and engage in ship-to-ship transfers in the middle of the ocean. The US knows this. The Treasury Department has sanctioned dozens of these tankers. But the trade keeps happening, because China needs the oil, and Venezuela needs the cash. So what does a submarine have to do with oil? Everything. By surfacing near a US warship, Venezuela was sending a "if you try to blockade us, we will make the Caribbean a very dangerous place for your Navy." And that's not an idle threat. The U.S. Navy is stretched thin, overcommit in the Pacific, undermanned in the Atlantic, and struggling with maintenance backlogs. The last thing it needs is a diesel-electric submarine popping up near a carrier strike group. But there's another layer to this. The Caribbean's maneuver wasn't just about Venezuela. It was about China. In the weeks leading up to the incident, a Chinese naval intelligence gathering ship, the Haiyang 24, was spotted loitering near Venezuela's coast. Then, just days after the submarine incident, China announced a new military cooperation agreement with Venezuela, including joint naval exercises. Coincidence? Hardly. China has been quietly extending its influence in Latin America for years, but this is different. This is military influence. And the US is watching it happen in real time, with no good options to stop it. The broader geopolitical how this fits into the new Cold War. Let's out for a moment. What we're witnessing in the Caribbean isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the end of American unipolarity in the Western Hemisphere. For the last 200 years, the U.S. has treated Latin America as its de facto sphere of influence. The Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt Corollary, the Bay of Pigs, the coups in Chile and Guatemala, the drug wars, the trade deals, all of it was about keeping the region under Washington's thumb. And for most of that time, it worked. Europe was too busy with its own wars, Russia was too weak, and China was still a peasant economy. But now we're in a multipolar world. And the rules have changed. Russia and China aren't just competing with the US economically, they're actively undermining American dominance in regions Washington has long considered its own. And they're doing it with a mix of economic coercion, military partnerships, and, crucially, asymmetric warfare. Venezuela is the perfect case study. The country is a failed state by most metrics: hyperinflation, mass emigration, collapsing infrastructure. But it's also strategically invaluable. It's the gateway to the Caribbean. It's a potential staging ground for Russian or Chinese forces. And, most importantly, it's a test case for how far the US is willing to go to maintain its hegemony. Here's the thing about it's expensive. And right now, the US is running out of money. The national debt is $34 trillion and climbing. The military budget is bloated, with the Pentagon failing its sixth consecutive audit. The Navy is shrinking, the Air Force is flying 50-year-old bombers, and the Army is struggling to recruit. Meanwhile, China is building 3 new naval ships for every one the US launches. Russia, despite its losses in Ukraine, is still a nuclear superpower with a military-industrial complex that's running at full tilt. So when a Venezuelan submarine surfaces near a US destroyer, it's not just a tactical move, it's a strategic one. It's a way for Russia and China to weaken challenge you in your own backyard, and you can't do a damn thing about it. And the worst part? They're right. Military, why this is more dangerous than it looks. Let's talk about the US Navy for a moment. Because if you listen to the hawks in Washington, you'd think the solution to Venezuela's provocations is blow the sub out of the water. But it's not that easy. First, there's the escalation problem. If the US sinks a Venezuelan submarine, what happens next? Does Maduro declare war? Does Russia send advisors? Does China activate its new military base in Cuba? The US has spent the last 20 years fighting insurgencies in the Middle East. It is not prepared for a conventional war in its own hemisphere. Second, there's the capability problem. The US Navy is terrible at anti-submarine warfare in littoral waters. Why? Because for the last 30 years, it's been focused on blue water dominance, projecting power in the open ocean, not hunting diesel-electric subs in shallow, noisy coastal waters. The Caribbean surfacing was a deliberate test of this weakness. And the Navy failed it. Third, there's the political problem. The US public has no appetite for another war. After Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, the idea of sending troops into Venezuela is a non-starter. Even the most hawkish members of Congress know this. So what's the alternative? Sanctions? They've been tried. They don't work. Regime change? The CIA's track record in Latin America is checkered, to say the least. So the US is stuck. It can't ignore the provocation, but it can't respond effectively either. And that's exactly the position Russia and China wanted in. This is how great powers lose wars, not in a single battle, but in 1,000 small cuts. A submarine here. A missile sail there. A port access agreement somewhere else. Until one day, the US wakes up and realizes it no longer controls its own hemisphere. The domestic political why this matters in an election year. Now, let's talk about politics. Because this isn't just about geopolitics, it's about votes. The Biden administration is in a bind. On one hand, it can't afford to look weak on Venezuela. Florida is a swing state, and the Cuban and Venezuelan exile communities there hate Maduro. If Biden appears soft, he loses votes. On the other hand, he can't afford a military confrontation either. The progressive wing of the Democratic Party would revolt if he started another war. And the American public? They're exhausted. So what does the White House do? It pretends the submarine incident didn't happen. It issues a few more sanctions. It sends a strongly worded letter to the UN. And it hopes the problem goes away. But here's the it won't. Because the Republicans love this issue. They're already framing it as Biden's weakness emboldening dictators. And they're not entirely wrong. The US has spent the last 3 years talking about restoring deterrence, but when a Venezuelan subsurfaces near a US destroyer, the response is a nothing. This is a gift to Trump and the GOP. They'll use it to paint Biden as feckless, as a man who can't stand up to America's enemies. And in an election year, that's dangerous. But here's the deeper: neither party has a real strategy for Latin America. The Democrats are stuck in a 1990s mindset, where engagement and democracy promotion are supposed to fix everything. The Republicans are stuck in a 1980s mindset, where rollback and regime change are the answers to every problem. Neither approach works in a world where China and Russia are actively competing for influence. So we're left with a policy of drift. And in geopolitics, drift is how empires lose. Scenario: what happens next? Let's game this out. Because the Caribbean incident isn't the end, it's the beginning. Scenario 1, the best case. The US and Venezuela enter a de facto stalemate. The US tightens sanctions, Venezuela continues selling oil to China, and both sides avoid direct confrontation. The submarine incident fades into memory. The status quo holds. Why? It's because neither side can afford the status quo. The US needs to reassert dominance. Venezuela needs to break the sanctions. And China? China wants this to escalate. Scenario 2, the most likely case. The US ramps up pressure. More sanctions. More naval patrols. Maybe even a limited blockade of Venezuelan ports. Venezuela responds with more provocations, submarine maneuvers, cyber attacks, proxy harassment of US allies in the region. Russia and China increase their support, turning Venezuela into a de facto client state. The US is forced into a long-term containment strategy, draining resources and attention from other theaters. Why? It's because containment only works if you have the will to enforce it. And right now, the US doesn't. Scenario 3, the worst case. A miscalculation. A Venezuelan sub gets too close. A US destroyer fires a warning shot. The sub doesn't back down. A torpedo is launched. A US ship is hit. Suddenly, the US is at war with Venezuela and by extension, Russia and China. Why? It's not as crazy as it because this is exactly how World War I started. A minor incident. A chain of miscalculations. And then boom, millions dead. Now, I'm not saying we're on the brink of World War III. But I am saying that the US is playing a very dangerous game in its own backyard, and it's doing so without a coherent strategy. The grand strategy why the US keeps losing. Let's be the US has no grand strategy for Latin America. For the last 30 years, Washington's approach to the region has been a mix of neglect and intervention. When things are quiet, Latin America is ignored. When things go wrong, the US either imposes sanctions or sends in the Marines. Neither approach works in a multipolar world. The problem is liberal hegemony, the idea that the US can and should dominate the world through a combination of military power, economic coercion, and democracy promotion. It's a fantasy. And it's failing. Look at the $1 trillion and thousands of lives later, Iran dominates Baghdad. 20 years of war, and the Taliban are back in power. A humanitarian intervention that turned into a failed state and a migrant crisis. The US is spending billions to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian, with no end in sight. And now, Venezuela. Another failed state. Another quagmire. Another example of American overreach. The US keeps trying to reshape the world in its image. But the world doesn't want to be reshaped. And the more the US tries, the more it loses. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the end of an era. The era of American unipolarity is over. And the US doesn't know how to function in a world where it's not the only superpower. What should the US do instead? So what's the alternative? How does the US navigate this new multipolar world without stumbling into another war? Here's what I'd recommend, controversial as it may. 1. Accept the Monroe Doctrine is dead. The US can no longer treat Latin America as its exclusive sphere of influence. China and Russia are here to stay. Now, what most people don't realize is that the Monroe Doctrine wasn't just some dusty 19th century relic, it was the operating system of American foreign policy for nearly 2 centuries. And like any outdated software, it's crashing the system. The US still acts as if it can flick a switch and make Latin America fall in line, but the region has spent the last 30 years quietly rewiring itself. China didn't just show up in Caracas with a checkbook in 2013. It spent decades building relationships, funding infrastructure, and embedding itself in the supply chains of countries Washington had long taken for granted. By the time the US noticed, it was too late. Venezuela's oil was already mortgaged to Beijing, its ports were being upgraded with Chinese loans, and its military was training with Russian advisors. This wasn't an accident, it was a deliberate, patient strategy of erosion. Here's the uncomfortable: the US doesn't have the bandwidth to compete in its own hemisphere. Not when it's simultaneously trying to contain China in the South China Sea, arm Ukraine against Russia, and manage a brewing crisis in the Middle East. The Pentagon's 2022 National Defense Strategy identified China as the pacing threat and Russia as an acute threat, but it barely mentioned Latin America beyond a few lines about transnational crime. That's not an oversight, that's a choice. And it's a choice that's leaving the door wide open for others to walk through. Let me explain why this matters. The Venezuelan submarine incident wasn't just a close call, it was a preview of how the next great power conflict could start. Not with a bang, but with a series of small, deniable provocations that escalate because no one has a clear red line. The U.S. Navy's Southern Command has seen a 300% increase in unprofessional intercepts by Russian and Chinese vessels in the Caribbean since 2018, according to a 2023 report by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. Moscow and Beijing are testing how far they can push before Washington pushes back. And so far, the answer pretty damn far. Take the case of Nicaragua. In 2022, Daniel Ortega's government quietly signed a deal with Russia to allow the deployment of humanitarian and military personnel to the country. The U.S. State Department issued a strongly worded statement. Ortega ignored it. A year later, Russian warships docked in Managua for routine port calls, and Russian military advisors were spotted at a newly renovated airbase near the Costa Rican border. The U.S. response? A few more sanctions on Ortega's inner circle. That's it. Because what else can they do? Invade Nicaragua like Reagan did in 1983? The political will for that kind of intervention evaporated after Iraq and Afghanistan. So instead, the U.S. is left with either accept that Russia is now a permanent fixture in Central America, or risk a direct confrontation that could spiral out of control. This is the new normal. The U.S. is no longer the sole hegemon in its own backyard, and it's struggling to adapt. The problem isn't just that China and Russia are present, it's that they're playing a different game. Washington still thinks in terms of alliances, sanctions, and military deterrence. Beijing and Moscow think in terms of economic leverage, information warfare, and plausible deniability. When the U.S. imposes sanctions on Venezuela, China steps in with a $5 billion loan. When the U.S. sends warships to the Caribbean, Russia sends submarines. It's a game of whack-a-mole, and the U.S. is always one step behind. Now, I can already hear the objections. But the U.S. is still the dominant military power in the region. True. The U.S. Southern Command has more firepower than the rest of Latin America combined. But military power is only useful if you're willing to use it. And after 2 decades of failed wars, the American public has zero appetite for another intervention. The last time the U.S. tried to overthrow a Latin American government, Venezuela, in 2019, it ended in humiliation. Juan Guaidó, the U.S.-backed opposition leader, was hailed as the country's legitimate president by over 50 countries. 3 years later, he was a political nonentity, and Nicolas Maduro was still in power. That's not a failure of execution, that's a failure of strategy. So what's the alternative? If the Monroe Doctrine is dead, what replaces it? The answer isn't isolationism. The U.S. can't just walk away from Latin America, it's too important for trade, migration, and security. But it does need to accept that it can no longer dictate the rules of the game. That means 3 things. First, the U.S. needs to stop treating Latin America as a battlefield in its global competition with China and Russia. The region isn't a pawn, it's a collection of sovereign states with their own interests. When the U.S. tries to strong-arm countries into picking sides, they push back. Look at Mexico. Andrés Manuel López Obrador has spent the last 5 years playing Washington and Beijing off each other, securing Chinese investment in his energy sector while still maintaining close ties with the U.S. on migration and security. That's not weakness, that's smart diplomacy. The U.S. should be doing the engaging with Latin America on its own terms, not as a subordinate ally but as an equal partner. Second, the U.S. needs to get serious about economic statecraft. For decades, Washington has relied on the IMF and the World Bank to shape Latin American economies. But those institutions are no longer the only game in town. China's Belt and Road Initiative has poured over $150 billion into the region since 2005, according to the Inter-American Dialogue. The U.S. can't match that kind of investment, but it can offer something China can't: access to the largest consumer market in the world. The Biden administration's Build Back Better World initiative was a step in the right direction, but it's been bogged down by bureaucracy and political infighting. If the US wants to counter China's influence, it needs to move faster and think bigger. That means streamlining trade deals, investing in infrastructure, and offering real alternatives to Chinese loans, not just empty rhetoric about democracy promotion. Third, the US needs to rethink its military posture in the region. The days of gunboat diplomacy are over, but that doesn't mean the US should abandon military engagement entirely. Instead of focusing on regime change and counter-narcotics operations, the Pentagon should prioritize building partner capacity and maritime domain awareness. That means more joint exercises with Latin American navies, more intelligence sharing, and more investment in cybersecurity. It also means accepting that some countries, like Venezuela and Nicaragua, are going to align with Russia and China, and that's their right. The goal shouldn't be to force them back into the US orbit, but to ensure that their choices don't threaten regional stability. Here's the bottom: the Venezuelan submarine incident was a wake-up call. Not because it was a major escalation, but because it revealed how unprepared the US is for the new geopolitical reality in its own hemisphere. The era of American dominance in Latin America is over. The question now is whether Washington can adapt or whether it will keep clinging to the past until it's too late. Here's the uncomfortable: the Venezuelan submarine incident wasn't just a wake-up call for the US Navy, it was a mirror held up to Washington's own domestic dysfunction. Because while the Pentagon scrambles to update its playbook for 21st century Latin America, the real battle isn't being fought in the Caribbean. It's being fought in the halls of Congress, the cable news studios, and the increasingly polarized mind of the American voter. And right now, the US is losing that fight too. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's boldness didn't emerge in a vacuum. It's a direct response to the collapse of bipartisan consensus in Washington on how to handle Latin America. For decades, U.S. policy toward the region was guided by a simple, if cynical, support anti-communist strongmen when convenient, promote free markets when possible, and intervene militarily when absolutely necessary. The Cold War gave this approach a veneer of coherence, but after 1991, that coherence evaporated. What replaced it was a series of ad hoc reactions: Plan Colombia in 2000, the failed 2002 coup against Chavez, the 2019 recognition of Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president that revealed a foreign policy establishment utterly unsure of its own objectives. Let me explain why this matters. The Guaidó episode was particularly instructive. In January 2019, the Trump administration, along with over 50 other countries, recognized the opposition leader as Venezuela's legitimate president, triggering a cascade of sanctions and diplomatic pressure. The theory was if the US and its allies could isolate Maduro economically and politically, his regime would collapse under its own weight. But the reality was far messier. Maduro didn't just survive, he consolidated power, purged the military, and deepened ties with Russia and China. Meanwhile, the US found itself in the absurd position of recognizing a government that controlled no territory, no institutions, and no real popular support. By 2023, even the Biden administration had quietly walked back its support for Guaidó, leaving US policy in a state of paralysis. Here's this kind of whiplash isn't just embarrassing, it's dangerous. When the US signals inconsistency, it creates openings for adversaries. Venezuela's submarine gambit wasn't just a show of force, it was a calculated bet that Washington's attention would be too fractured to respond effectively. And so far, that bet has paid off. The US has imposed sanctions, sure, but sanctions are a tool of last resort, not a strategy. They're the foreign policy equivalent of a doctor prescribing aspirin for a gunshot wound. It might dull the pain, but it won't stop the bleeding. The deeper problem is that US domestic politics now dictate foreign policy in ways that would have been unthinkable during the Cold War. Back then, Republicans and Democrats might have disagreed on tactics, but they shared a broad consensus on the end containing Soviet influence. Today, that consensus is gone. On Latin America, the right is obsessed with immigration and drug trafficking, while the left is fixated on human rights and climate change. Neither side has a coherent vision for how to engage with a region that is increasingly assertive, increasingly non-aligned, and increasingly willing to play the US off against China and Russia. Take the case of Mexico. In 2020, then-President Donald Trump threatened to designate Mexican cartels as terrorist organizations, a move that would have given the US legal cover to conduct military operations on Mexican soil. The proposal went nowhere, but it revealed the extent to which U.S. policy toward Latin America is now hostage to domestic political posturing. Meanwhile, Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has skillfully exploited this dysfunction, alternating between cozying up to Washington on trade and thumbing his nose at it on issues like energy policy and migration. The result? A relationship that is simultaneously more important and more volatile than ever. Now, let's talk about the 2024 election, because it's going to matter a lot. If Trump returns to the White House, we can expect a return to the maximum pressure, more sanctions, more threats, and more bluster. But Trump's approach to Latin America has always been transactional, not strategic. He'll cut deals with strongmen if it suits him, as he did with Bolsonaro in Brazil, and he'll abandon allies just as quickly, as he did with Guaido. The problem is that transactional foreign policy doesn't work in a region where the rules of the game are changing. Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua have all learned to survive without U.S. approval, and they're not going to change course just because Trump tweets about them. If Biden wins re-election, the approach will be more multilateral, but no less ineffective. The administration's root causes strategy for Central America, which aims to address the drivers of migration by investing in economic development, is a step in the right direction. But it's also woefully underfunded, just $4 billion over 4 years, compared to the $150 billion China has poured into the region, and it's being undermined by congressional gridlock. Meanwhile, the U.S. continues to treat migration as a law enforcement issue rather than a geopolitical one, which plays right into the hands of populists like Mexico's López Obrador and El Salvador's Nayib Bukele, who used the border crisis to rally their bases. Here's the scenario: I'm watching most of Venezuela-style crisis in another Latin American country, but this time with a twist. Imagine a scenario where Ecuador, which is already teetering on the edge of state collapse, elects a leftist president who aligns with the Maduro model. The U.S. would likely respond with sanctions, but Ecuador isn't Venezuela, it's a dollarized economy, and its collapse would send shockwaves through the U.S. financial system. Or consider Brazil, where Lula is walking a tightrope between courting Western investors and maintaining his anti-American rhetoric. If Brazil were to default on its debt or nationalize key industries, the U.S. would face an impossible intervene and risk alienating the region's largest economy, or do nothing and watch China step in to fill the void. The uncomfortable truth is that the U.S. no longer has the luxury of choosing between engagement and isolation in Latin America. The region is too important, too volatile, and too interconnected with U.S. interests to ignore. But the domestic political environment makes it nearly impossible to craft a coherent strategy. The left wants to focus on climate and human rights, the right wants to focus on security and trade, and neither side is willing to make the hard choices necessary to compete with China. So where does that leave us? In a reactive. The U.S. will continue to lurch from crisis to crisis, imposing sanctions here, cutting deals there, and hoping that anything, sticks. Meanwhile, China will keep building ports, Russia will keep selling arms, and countries like Venezuela will keep testing the limits of U.S. tolerance. The Venezuelan submarine incident was a warning shot, but it was also a preview of what's to come. The question isn't whether the U.S. will face another challenge like this, it's when, and whether Washington will be ready. And right now, the answer to that question is a resounding no. Now, what most people don't realize is that this reactive posture isn't just a policy failure, it's a structural one. The U.S. foreign policy establishment still operates under the assumption that Latin America is a secondary theater, a place where Washington can afford to play whack-a-mole with crises rather than develop a long-term strategy. But that assumption is dangerously outdated. The region is no longer just a backyard, it's a battleground for influence, a source of critical minerals, and a potential vector for instability that could ripple directly into U.S. domestic politics. The Venezuelan submarine incident wasn't just a tactical surprise, it was a symptom of a much deeper the erosion of U.S. deterrence in its own hemisphere. Let me explain why this matters. Deterrence isn't just about military power, it's about credibility. And right now, U.S. credibility in Latin America is in freefall. Consider the numbers. In 2000, the U.S. accounted for 55% of Latin America's trade. By 2022, that figure had dropped to 32%, while China's share had surged from 2% to 18%. In the same period, Chinese investment in the region grew from $12 billion to over $160 billion, much of it in infrastructure projects that come with strings attached, strings that often lead back to Beijing's strategic interests. Meanwhile, the US has spent the last 2 decades oscillating between neglect and heavy-handed intervention, from the failed coup in Venezuela in 2002 to the botched response to the 2019 Lima Group strategy, which left Juan Guaido's opposition movement stranded and humiliated. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has no grand strategy for Latin America because it has no coherent vision for what it wants the region to look like in 20 years. Is it a zone of democratic stability, integrated into the US economy through nearshoring and supply chain resilience? Or is it a buffer against Chinese and Russian influence, where the US tolerates authoritarianism as long as it's not explicitly anti-American? The Biden administration's approach, vague commitments to democratic values paired with ad hoc sanctions and occasional high-level visits, suggests it hasn't decided. And that indecision is costing the US dearly. Take the case of Mexico, which should be the crown jewel of US influence in the region. Instead, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has spent the last 5 years playing Washington and Beijing off each other, securing Chinese investment in lithium mining while simultaneously demanding US cooperation on migration. The result? The US is now dependent on Mexico for everything from auto parts to fentanyl interdiction, but it has no leverage to shape Mexican policy. AMLO, for his part, knows this, and he's not afraid to remind Washington. In 2022, he refused to attend the Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles after the US excluded Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, a move that underscored just how little influence the US has over its closest neighbor. So what are the alternatives? The first, and most obvious, is for the US to accept that it can't compete with China on a dollar-for-dollar basis and instead focus on what it does: building resilient alliances. That means investing in regional institutions that actually work, like the Inter-American Development Bank, rather than propping up failed organizations like the Organization of American States. It means offering Latin American countries a real alternative to Chinese debt traps, not just lectures about transparency, but concrete financing for green energy and infrastructure projects that don't come with geopolitical strings attached. And it means recognizing that democracy promotion can't be a one-size-fits-all policy. The US tolerated military coups in Honduras and Brazil when it suited its interests. It can't credibly claim the moral high ground now. The second alternative is to double down on hard power, but in a smarter way. The Venezuelan submarine incident proved that the US Navy can still project force in the region, but it also exposed the limits of that force. A better approach would be to work with regional partners to develop a shared maritime security architecture, one that focuses on countering illicit trafficking, drugs, weapons, and now, increasingly, Chinese and Russian intelligence operations rather than chasing submarines. The US could also leverage its economic power more effectively, using tools like the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act to target corrupt elites in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba without punishing entire populations. The key here is precision. Sanctions that hurt ordinary people only push them into the arms of China and Russia. The third alternative is the most radical, and the one Washington is least likely to disengagement. Not in the sense of abandoning the region entirely, but in the sense of accepting that Latin America is no longer a US sphere of influence and that trying to maintain one is counterproductive. This would mean reducing the US military footprint in the region, ending the failed war on drugs, and focusing instead on protecting core US interests like securing the southern border and preventing the establishment of foreign military bases. It would also mean accepting that some countries, like Venezuela, are lost causes and that the US should focus on containing their influence rather than trying to overthrow their governments. None of these alternatives are perfect, and none are without risks. But the status quo is unsustainable. The US is sleepwalking into a future where Latin America becomes a permanent zone of competition, where Chinese naval bases in the Caribbean are a reality, and where every crisis, from a Venezuelan default to a Brazilian debt collapse, threatens to spill over into US politics. The Venezuelan submarine incident was a wake-up call, but it was also a test. And the US failed. What worries me most is that Washington still doesn't seem to understand the stakes. The Pentagon's 2022 National Defense Strategy mentions Latin America exactly once, in passing, as if the region were an afterthought. The State Department's Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs is chronically underfunded, and its leadership is often treated as a consolation prize for failed ambassadors. Meanwhile, China is playing the long game, investing in ports, 5G networks, and space programs that will give it a permanent foothold in the region. Russia, for its part, is happy to play the spoiler, selling arms to Venezuela and Nicaragua while stoking anti-American sentiment in the media. The question isn't whether the US can afford to ignore Latin America, it's whether it can afford not to. The region is home to 650 million people, vast reserves of lithium, copper, and rare earth minerals, and some of the world's most critical shipping lanes. It's also a potential source of mass migration, organized crime, and political instability that could directly threaten U.S. security. The Venezuelan submarine incident was a reminder that the U.S. can't take its dominance in the region for granted. But it was also a warning that the window to act is closing. I've spent my career studying how great powers decline, and one of the most consistent patterns is their inability to adapt to changing realities. The U.S. is no exception. It clings to the idea that Latin America is still its backyard, even as China builds highways in Peru and Russia sells missiles to Venezuela. It insists on framing every crisis in moral terms, democracy versus authoritarianism, even as its own allies in the region, from Mexico to El Salvador, flout democratic norms. And it refuses to acknowledge that its own policies, from the war on drugs to the failed coup in Venezuela, have contributed to the very instability it now seeks to contain. The Venezuelan submarine incident was a shock, but it shouldn't have been a surprise. The U.S. has been losing influence in Latin America for decades, and the signs have been there for anyone willing to see them. The question now is whether Washington will wake up in time to do something about it, or whether it will keep lurching from crisis to crisis, until one day, it wakes up to find that the region has slipped away entirely. If that happens, the next submarine in the Caribbean won't just be a warning shot. It'll be a declaration of a new order. And by then, it'll be too late to do anything about it.